Next up, we have our narrow-minded segment, which is a focus on narrow gauge with Steve Sherrill, and he's going to do why we choose what we model and the scale that we choose. But before we have Steve come on, he's sponsored by Carroll Creek Designs.
Carroll Creek Design Group is an innovative new model railroad supplier with products for all scales. The Carroll Creek team uses advanced processes, including resin and filament 3D printing and laser engraving and cutting. These tools enable us to produce a range of products. We produce different rolling stock and motive power models in multiple scales. We are narrow-minded and focus on narrow gauge and unique backwards models. We have a great selection of ON30, ON18 and HON3 products. Our product range includes complete kits, ready-to-run models, and detail parts. In addition to our products, we are available for custom design, 3D printing, and laser cutting. See our products on our webpage at the QR code. We look forward to meeting you.
Thank you for being a sponsor, Carroll Creek Design. And next we have Steve. Speaking of heroes and great modelers, welcome.
Oh, wow. Well, tonight we're going to talk about why we model what we do and why we choose the scale that we choose. So I'm going to try to get some help on this because I know why I model what I model, because I like, and I've always liked, a short line type railroad, and narrow gauge kind of fills that bill. And it's a challenge to kit bash and create some of the newer ON18 models. And so that's where I am right now. I have built these little micro layouts, and they're a lot of fun to build. They don't take very long. And you can just make them any way you want. You can make them caricatures. You can make them funny. You can make them for Halloween. You can do anything with them. And the scale is O scale, so it's about the same size as HO. And it has a little bit of size, and we can still use our O scale buildings. So now you take another type of modeler, like Greg Cassidy, for instance. Greg, if you're on here, I know that you're a HO, but you model Western Maryland. You have picked a prototype. Greg, are you there?
Yep.
Now, let's go and let me ask you, why did you pick Western Maryland? Although I have a good idea, because of where you live is probably one of the reasons that you selected that. You could ride to the Western Maryland rail sites and visit the actual scenes.
Yeah, there were a multitude of reasons for picking Western Maryland. Growing up in Maryland, when I first started modeling, everything was B&O. But as I found out more about Western Maryland, I realized they were more like an underdog. Everyone roots for the underdog. A lot of their infrastructure had not been taken over. It had been abandoned, which meant you could go and poke around it a lot more. And also its colors during its speed lettering era were black and gold. And as an old Lotus racer, black and gold was one of my favorite colors. So there were a number of reasons.
Now, on your railroad, do you model just certain areas? Like, do you model scenes, or do you model building structures? Or what do you...
Representations of areas with specific buildings that were in that area. I'm modeling the western sub of Western Maryland, which ran between Hagerstown and Cumberland. And I can only get a little bit of it into the small layout that I have, but I have a representation of the town of Hancock, and I have a building that was one of the cold storage buildings Hancock was actually quite a fruit producing area, especially with apples in the latter 19th century and early part of the 20th century. And then I have a couple of representations where Western Maryland had bridges going over creeks and into a tunnel. And that was a look that I really liked, and I was able to get that onto the layout as well.
Okay. So anybody have any questions for Greg?
I
Okay.
will say one thing that I found that I enjoyed doing, after building the layout, I've transitioned to building structures, and I haven't kept myself limited to HO in that. And I've built structures all the way from O and S down to N, and I actually have one Z scale. And modeling in all the different structures, I see the appeal of them all. And just by doing buildings, I don't have to devote a lot of space to one.
Have you always lived in the same area?
Yes.
Okay, so you may have seen some of the actual Western Maryland engines and rolling down the rails.
It's likely I could have.
I remember B&O was where I was growing up down there, which I live near you, of course. But thank you. Larry McDonald, I want to talk to you for a minute, please. Larry is one of our Canadian.
I'm here.
All right, Larry. Now you're an ON3 guy who also has O scale. Am I correct?
That's correct. Well, O still standard. They're all O scale.
Okay. Now, as an ON3 modeler, how did you come about to go into ON3? I know there's a lot of ON3 modelers up in Canada. Are they your neighbors? Or are they within travel distance? What
Yes.
got you interested in ON3?
Well, okay. First, I'll just say I started out living when I moved to Toronto, getting into model railroading, and I was an HO and belonged to a large HO club. And I was in HO for many years, and I even actually modeled Western Maryland at home. I started traveling down that way and with a friend that was in the CNO Historical Society. So I joined the Western Maryland and the CNO and enjoyed myself immensely down there. But there was, like you say, up here in the Golden, around Toronto, there was a group well known, the Maple Leaf Mafia, which was, the name was given by some American fellows, which you will know, down in Kimberton. And that's how we got that name. We've mellowed it down now. We're Maple Leaf modelers, so we don't scare anybody.
Yeah.
But, anyway, I chose the ON3 because Lex Parker was a big influence. I went to see his layout. And just the detail going into O scale, no matter what, if you're an ON30, ON3, O standard, the buildings are pretty much the same size, depending on what the prototype that you're modeling or close to whatever you're doing, and the size of the figures on the automobiles. I just enjoyed working on them more than I did in HO, and so that's how I initially got in. I was welcomed aboard in that group, and I've been with them now for almost 40 years. And the thing I like about the ON3, I can be an O scale. My railroad room is 25 by 14 with 2 alcoves, and I can fit a pretty good operating railroad in ON3 in there, where an O standard gauge, I'd be more challenged. And
Are you modeling? You're not modeling Colorado, are you? Which is
I was like everybody. Almost the whole group was modeling Colorado. We had then one fellow come on board, and he's doing a Cuban railroad. We have some other fellow. One fellow is doing a narrow gauge railroad in Ontario up here. And, but primarily all the guys were Colorado, and I started traveling to Colorado, and the engines were available in Denver, Rio Grande West, and RGS, CNS were just absolutely beautiful. And they're still the nicest engines to this date I'll ever own. But I'm turning away from them. I have to go to other models to cobble up something that was on narrow gauge rails in British Columbia. So,
well, I knew when I saw the ON3, and I was around that for about 30 years. I just could not afford to go there. The locomotives were expensive, And so I had to, closest I got was SN3. And I had a complete SN3 layout, but I didn't have any of the big SN3 models, the Demon Rio Grandes and things like that, because they got too expensive. So I had to leave that. And then when ON30 came out, that's where I went. You know, to me, that was the answer. And so I moved, had a much larger space, a separate building. And so I built that, you know, my current layout, which, you know, I run every day. Some of it, it's all battery powered. So
I'm glad to hear that.
Always trying to find some new adventure, you know, to keep me interested. And so now ON18 is taken over.
Yep.
But there's a lot of great modelers doing a lot of different scales. And I don't know, Martin, are you still on here? I don't know if,
No, Martin dropped off, but
yeah, okay.
Steve, why don't I real quickly, this is Phil Edholm. You know, I did an article for the NMRA magazine about this, and I think it really pertains to what you're talking about. So
Yeah,
let me share just an image here, and
okay.
oh, wrong share. I got to share the right thing. It's often a challenge. So this is a view, being, you know, an engineer and looking at data. It's an interesting thought process about scale, which is we talk about scale in a single dimension, but the reality is, as human beings, we perceive scale either as area, which is 2 dimensions, or as detail, which is 3 dimensions. And when you look at, for example, HO, if you assume HO and O, for example, are 2 to 1, where O is twice as large as HO, when you perceive that as area, you're going to perceive it as 4 times as much area. When you perceive it as detail, it's going to be 8 times as much. Now, the reality is it's about 7.2 in reality, but it's still a significant change. It turns out that squares tend to change at an exponent rate that's a square exponent, where detail is a cube exponent. So what this chart tries to show is the relative values of the scales for area and detail. So clearly on the left with Z scale, you get the maximum amount of area, but you have the minimum amount of detail. On the right with G, you get the maximum amount of detail and the minimum amount of area. And you can kind of see that the correlation actually falls for what I'll call standard gauge, where S is kind of almost in the middle of a ideal combination of detail and area. HO lends a little bit more towards area with a little bit less detail, and O obviously a little bit more detail than area. But I think one of the things you've referenced, I think this is very interesting for a lot of folks in this group and around the country, are if you go to narrow gauge, it allows you to go up essentially a scale in size. So for example, going to O narrow gauge gives you cars and also the rest of the models, because you tend to be modeling communities that are smaller in scale, buildings that are smaller in scale, because the railroads are smaller in scale, the communities tend to be smaller in scale. So it allows you to actually model an area that's larger, but get the advantage of detail. So I think one of the things to think about when you look at choosing your scale is to think about what's really important to you to model. Obviously, if you are a operations focused modeler and what you're really interested in having a large operating railroad and have, 10 people come over, 15 people come over and operate your railroad, then area is going to be very important to you. So choosing a scale like HO may be important. If on the other hand, you're a model builder and you're really concerned about building highly detailed models, then choosing O scale and potentially narrow gauge may be a better choice. So I think it's just an interesting way of thinking about the trade-offs you have when you choose a scale between the size, the detail side of things, and the area you can actually model in the space you have available. And I think coming back to the comment that was made earlier by Larry, you're limited in the space in your room, so going to something like full size standard gauge O scale or G scale wouldn't fit, but narrow gauge O scale or maybe S scale standard might fit. So anyway, just an interesting thought as you think about these options.
That's right. And the other thing that's appealing about when I went to O scale narrow gauge, there wasn't the ready to run cars in the 1980s. It was all kits or scratch built rolling stock or brass. There was brass cabooses and tank cars and such.
Yeah.
Predominantly, you were building an awful lot more than I did when I was in HO. And even the same with buildings. It was building kits. It wasn't where you just go get a building and come bring it home and plump it on the layout and that's it. So that was appealing. And you get to be creative and sort of create your own signature. You're developing a signature on your layout that's unique to you.
Phil, now you're ON30.
Steve.
Why did you pick ON30?
So I actually was in HO back in the 80s and 90s. I had a Sierra Railroad Sierra Railroad themed private label HO railroad in a bedroom around the walls. Had spent a lot of time building it. Ended up having to move and tore it out, and that was kind of emotionally debilitating. And my job changed. When I got back to the hobby in 2015, ON30, when I was in the 1990 timeframe, ON30 was just kind of taking off. And I saw it as being a very interesting alternative to HO. What really got me into ON30 was I went to a train show and met a bunch of modular modelers, the California Central Coast Group, that were doing ON30 modules. And to me, it was really the ideal combination of a scale that let me do detail and do modeling that I like to do. You kind of see that behind me on the image here.
Mm-hmm.
And then the modular was, to me, a great idea that you weren't building a layout in a room that if you decided you had to move, you would tear out.
Yeah.
And so really that's what got me to ON30. I think that finally the final nail is that the cost structure of being able to use HO components and quite frankly, Bachmann and the wonderful models they built in that time frame was another significant part of it. So I think I found it not because I thought a lot logically about scale of area versus detail and that, but because for my modeling interest, it was kind of the ideal. As Larry says, I've kind of always been attracted to kind of branch lines, smaller railroads, not the mainline railroads.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you, Phil. Thank you, Larry. Thank you, Greg. Thank you, Steve. A scale for every purpose, whether you want to do operation, whether you want to do modeling. That's an interesting chart, puts it all in perspective. Any closing remarks, Mr. Sherrill?
Well, I just think that narrow gauge is really worth trying. Everybody thinks that narrow gauge is the Rocky Mountains and things like that. They associate it with that, but it doesn't have to be that. It can be perfectly freelance.
Yeah, exactly.
Create your own world, and the advantage of it is you can do that. Of course, you can do that at any scale, but it's like it lends itself to a narrow gauge where they would build a lot of cars in their own shops. They would do engine repairs. They would do all these things. And it just lets you create, I believe, a lot more than if you followed a standard railroad like the B&O or Western Maryland or something like that.
Agreed. It really depends whether you prefer prototype or freelancing. And like you say, there's no perfect scale or perfect modeling, but narrow gauge does open it up for sure. Well, thank you, Steve, and look forward to your next presentation.